There was a young preacher that was flattered when someone described him as a model preacher. He was kind of looking for compliments, young preacher. And so he carried around in his pocket one of these pocket dictionaries. And so when he could, he went and looked up, what it said there in his dictionary, and it said model. I was called a model preacher. Model, a small imitation of the real thing. So then the next time, he was a little bit on guard and a little bit more cautious, and when someone described him as a warm minister, he turned to his dictionary and went, warm, not so hot. Oh, well, we can twist things around if we want, can't we, in life? Would you be a person who would be described or characterized as having an irrepressible optimism? An irrepressible optimism and a tendency to find good in everything. Would that describe you? Some of you are getting jabbed in the sides. Anyway, the next question is, would you like to be? Have an irrepressible optimism and a tendency to find good in everything. Hopefully we can all see value in developing that into our own personal consciousness and being the kind of a person who really has an optimism and sees the bright side and puts the light twist on most everything and sees good and looks for good. Having an irrepressible optimism and this tendency to see good in everything is actually pretty much the dictionary's definition of the word Pollyanna. Pollyanna. And now Pollyanna is a word to describe sort of an extreme. I have not seen the word Pollyanna often used in a favorable way. It's sort of negative, it's sort of judgmental. You don't necessarily want to be called Pollyanna. It's not a compliment, and it's seen as being unrealistic, perhaps to an extreme. It's excessive optimism, perhaps, and it's pie in the sky. It's head in the sand, those kinds of things. But actually, I want to say that an irrepressible optimism and this tendency to seek and see good in everything, I think, sounds pretty good to me. And it's something that I think is rather empowering and would be helpful and an asset to anyone's life to be on that side of the scale to perhaps an extreme. And it's the person that I would like to have around me or to be around, for sure. And just ask yourself, what would the opposite be? Would it be more meaningful to have a person or be a person that has an irrepressible pessimism? Or a tendency to find the worst always in everything, and we maybe have met some people like that along the way in our journey of life, The Bible actually would like to have us be, or invites us to be, sort of Pollyanna-ish. And there are stories that indicate that kind of being drawn that way. And one of the probably great examples of this is the story of Joseph, and being an example of just incredible optimism and seeing the good. And, you're all familiar with the story, and I can just give a little synopsis of it to kind of remind you. And if you remember, Joseph, he's left to die by his brothers. How do you overcome that? Your brothers leave you to die. But he somehow makes his way past that, and then he is sold into slavery. And then after that, he is sent to prison. His life comes back a little bit, and he's working, got a job, and all of a sudden he's sent to prison through an inaccurately reported incident with Potiphar's wife. He was framed. And so through all these series of things, he's getting knocked down, and horrible things are happening seemingly in his life, and he never seems to get down. And this is a story in the Bible, really, that is there for a reason. It's telling us, it was included, and he never steps into the victim state. And as you know, the story goes on, and he had a gift, the ability to interpret dreams, and he was given the opportunity to interpret Pharaoh's dream. Somehow he was heard about in prison, and so he interpreted. And one way or another, he makes his way up to being second in command over all of Egypt, and second only to Pharaoh himself. And he, as a result, is able to save Egypt from famine, and not only Egypt, all of Egypt, but his own family in the process. And so when his brothers come later, after he has done all of this and accomplished all of this, and they discover that it's their brother who they wanted dead, that was the one who was providing the food for them and got them through the famine, well, they were beside themselves, and they were just horrified and felt guilt and remorse and even fear that he would take revenge on them. And there is that classic line in that story that's so important. If you haven't memorized it or gotten it, it's really, again, this idea of what we're talking about, where Joseph says to his brothers and states, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. All right? And so his example there is to say, basically, I'm the kind of person that looks for finding the good in everything, and that's the way I'm going to look at this. Now, he could have said, all right, here's my chance. You guys really tried to do me in. Now I'll give you a little bit of your own medicine. But he didn't do that. That wasn't his way. He basically said and understood, because he was connected to the divine, he said, if this and this and this and this hadn't happened, and all of these sequence of things, I wouldn't have been in the position to save thousands of people's lives, help a country, and help my family as well, all of you. And sometimes it's not obvious what we're going through can lead to something greater, but that's a place to come from. There's a statement that many a person has, I've heard say, even in interviews on TV many times when they've gone through something, they say, everything happens for a reason. I believe that everything happens for a reason. And what they're saying is that the story isn't over yet. It hasn't come to an end. Okay? Because if something good hasn't happened in the result of various things happening to you, then it's still not the end. You haven't gotten to the end of that phase. Okay? And Joseph is, in the Bible, characterized as one who loves God. And it talks about that. Joseph was one who loved God, and he loved truth, and he wanted to, really be enthusiastic in living the truth and applying that. And he is an example of that scripture that says all things work together for good for those who love God. He is that. He is the epitome of that. It's divine order that is reigning. There is a proclamation that there is a divine order happening in our life. And sometimes when things seem to go amok and not happening, we need to affirm a divine order is unfolding. Even when we can't see it, there's an order to things. And that's important for us to get into our consciousness so that we don't take ourselves down into the muck and the mire and get lost in there somewhere and lose sight of the light, really. And so it's saying that when life tends to give us lemons, that we partner with God and make lemonade. That's what it's about. Now, the scriptures encourage us in numerous ways, and one passage that I like and that I think you're familiar with, you've heard before, that really characterizes this idea of having an irrepressible optimism is found in Philippians chapter 4. And it basically starts out by saying, finally, brethren, and goes on to say the verse, but that finally, brethren, in my estimation, is saying, finally, when all is said and done, when you've looked at it all, when you've gone through it all and done it all and lived it all, finally, brethren, really, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. Think on these things. Okay, so that there is a way of thinking, there is a way of seeing, and there is a way of being in the world that might be called Pollyanna, but it basically is spiritually rooted. That's what we're being called to. If we have to be one-sided to an extreme, boy, let me be there. All right? Because it works. It serves us. Because science has told us and actually backed up the idea that thought is creative. Okay? Thoughts held in mind do produce after their kind. That you are co-creating your reality. And there's so much that has gone into backing that up over time in the last 100 years. But it's always been taught as a universal principle. And we know the mind-body connection now. And we know that there have been studies and experiments and all kinds of things that have been done to show that this is the case. And we've had scientists and physicians come out emphatically, physicians like Norman Shealy and Dean Ornish and Bernie Siegel and other people like Deepak Chopra, more current, and what have you. So we need to know and realize that it's a significant challenge, however, to develop the ability to find the good in everything. That isn't easy. That's something that has to be developed. That's a consciousness building thing. And it's a great place to live from, is the tendency that no matter what, you're going to really come from the intention to find something good here, something that I can learn, something that I can grow from, something that will flex the muscles spiritually, internally within me that I haven't flexed for a while. It's like we have physical muscles, but we also have spiritual muscles, and we're given things that we have to exercise certain aspects of the spiritual realm and attributes. And so, it's a powerful release inside when we, I think, cease trying to control everything in our life, too. We sometimes are of the thought that we have to control others, we have to control events, we have to control everything, protect ourselves, and we have to get to a place where we're a bit more accepting of what comes our way, maybe the cards that we're dealt, or what it is that life has put in front of us, that it's giving us an opportunity to really just come out shining as best we can in spite of what may be happening here. And our willingness to keep knowing that there can be anything at any moment that turns this around and the good emerges, even when we can't see it. And whatever it is, that there is a willingness to paint light around it. That is a gift. You see, if you're in a company or in a group and you have projects you're working on, even at work or within a family, and you're going down some path and you get hit from blindside by certain things, if you are the one that keeps the focus on, keep going, there's something good here, we can't give up, you paint light around it, that's a gift. That's a real gift. The world needs more of those individuals in the world. Those are the people who we have honored through time. Perhaps many or most of you are familiar with the story or the novel out of which the word Pollyanna comes. Pollyanna is the name of the heroine of a novel by the same name. And this novel was written by Eleanor Porter in 1913, almost 100 years ago. And there was a movie made of that Pollyanna story, and in 1920, the first movie. And some of you have seen various times this old movie has come up. I haven't seen it for a number of years, but there's a book out as well. But I think there's a DVD or something out there that you can rent to see it if you're interested. But Pollyanna is this little girl. She's 11 years old, as the story goes, and her mother's name was Jenny. And Jenny named her daughter after her two sisters. Her two sisters' names were Polly and Anna. And so she named her daughter Pollyanna. And Pollyanna, in the story, she comes to this town called Beldingsville. And she comes to this town at the point in the story where she's going to live with her aunt. And she's going to live with her aunt because her mother has died some years ago already. And now her father has just died. So she has nowhere to go, and she has to go live with this aunt. And it's Miss Polly is her aunt and her mother's sister. And Miss Polly is stern. She's severe-faced. She's just this woman that has been handed the disagreeable task of raising a little girl that she wasn't on her bucket list to raise, okay? And so it's a forced upon her duty and not a desire by any means. And so the aunt herself, it is said, has been alone all these years, and now in her mid-40s or early 40s, and she has faced losing her father, losing her mother, losing her sisters. So there's some things that happened in her life. And it seems also that she, according to the story, it's a wonderful story, she had grown bitter and angry after a love affair with a man who still lived in the town. That love affair had come apart, and it was in her younger days. But she had hung on to that. We can all relate to. It's a great story because there are events that can happen in our lives that we cling to and we let affect us. And we carry a cloud around us perhaps for way too long, sometimes for the rest of our lives, because somehow it puts our light out or it pulls away from our spirit, our aliveness. And this is what has happened to this aunt, Polly, in this story. And so we can see some of ourselves in some of the characters here in this. And so in the story, the gardener was named Tom, and Tom the gardener, in talking about Polly, and Polly said that was when she changed. So she wasn't always like that. It was at the time that she met and had this trouble with her lover. And he said, it seems as if she's been feeding on wormwood and thistles ever since. You know, she's that bitter, prickly kind of person, you know. Anyway, so Pollyanna then distinguishes herself as this irrepressible spirit immediately. She's talkative, she's vibrant, she's friendly, she's alive, she's smiling all the time, and just makes the best, has the ability to turn things into something positive wherever she goes. And she refuses to condemn anyone. She says people who are angry and bitter, that's just them on the outside, that at their core there's a true light that wants to shine. And the first evening that she spent there at her aunt's house, her aunt sent her to this attic room. Now her aunt had no one living in the house. It was two-story. They had some big rooms in the second floor, but didn't send her there, sent her to the attic, you know. And so Pollyanna gets up there, and she just finds something to be glad and grateful about in the attic. Okay, that's her approach. She's late for dinner the first night she's called, and so her aunt, and as punishment, sends her to the kitchen where she can only eat bread and have milk with Nancy, who's the maid in the kitchen. And so she gets to the kitchen, and Nancy apologizes for her having to be there and having to only have bread and milk. And Pollyanna says, Nancy says, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And Pollyanna says, "Don't be sorry. I'm not sorry. I'm really happy to be here. I like bread and milk, and I like talking with you." So it was like, again, you get the gist of Pollyanna, all right? And you get the gist of how this term has evolved over time, for those of you who may not know. And so Nancy comments that she didn't, that to her, Pollyanna, that she didn't seem to have trouble being glad about anything and everything. And Pollyanna then says, well, that's the game. That's the game, She calls it the just being glad game. It's just being glad. It's a game, And it was her father who taught her the game, and when she was very young, and her mother had already died, and so he had conveyed that. And there was this, she cited where there was a time where, as a minister, her father, they had a missionary barrel back in those days, and people would go out with the barrel and get it filled with things that people needed that other people were willing to give up. And so every once a month or something, this barrel would be brought into the church, and sometimes people would make requests as to what they wanted. And so in one instance, her father, the minister, asked for the person to find a doll for her daughter, Pollyanna. And when the barrel came back, there was no doll. There was a note that said, couldn't find a doll, but brought a pair of crutches. She might need it sometime in her life. And so that's when her dad taught her the just glad game. And so honey, be glad that you don't need these crutches, and you're never going to need those crutches. Just be glad. And so anyway, she said to Nancy in the kitchen that it was a lovely game that my father taught, and the harder it is to be glad about something, the more fun it becomes. And she said, however, sometimes it's almost too hard, like when my father passed on and died. So clearly there are events where we can't just be in the fluff. There are moments where we feel the pain of events and happenings, and we have to go through it, but we can't live there. We can't stay in the valley. We have to move on out. We have to get back into the glad game, is what she's saying. So everywhere that this little girl went, it's a great story, everywhere that this little girl went, she taught this game to the people that she came to know, and it began to change their lives. And she said, that she told how her aunt had tried to punish her several times at the beginning when they had been in the relationship. And Pollyanna, you just couldn't punish her. She'd turn it around. And so the aunt stopped punishing her after the third time she had delivered some kind of punishment that was being taken as a special reward for merit. So, you can't punish this girl. And anyway, these and many other things that Pollyanna was about and did had a transformational impact on her aunt. And in one instance, Pollyanna said to Nancy, the maid in the kitchen, in a conversation, she says, "I just love people, don't you? I just love people, I think this little girl really, in the story, represents a mystic, or the mystic in all of us. I just love people. I just love life. I just love finding what's there to love, It's a powerful thing. It didn't matter who she met or where she met them or what they were like, When she met them, she always seemed to beam her light into their life and make their life a little brighter. And just they gave some examples in the story, and there was like Mrs. Snow, who basically was down on her luck. She was flat on her back in bed. She was sickly. She was unhappy. She was miserable. No one liked to visit her. Virtually no one did. Pollyanna brought her food, would compliment her on her black hair, offered to comb it out, and taught her the glad game, and got this lady to at least be glad that other folks weren't as sick and miserable as she was. Hey, listen, whatever you can do, that works. John Pendleton was also an unhappy, cross man, and she found him right at the time that he had just broken his leg. So she called for help, and then after he got fixed up, she circled back to visit him, and she helped teach him the glad game, and they came to the decision that he could be glad that the broken leg won't last forever, they heal, and be glad that you broke only one leg, not two. Okay, and there was a Dr. Chilton who she helped also gain a perspective. He was a doctor, and the doctor somehow didn't realize the impact that he was having in the world. Sometimes we just are so false in our impressions of ourselves. And so she helped him see that he should be the happiest of all, and how he as a doctor was helping reduce the suffering of so many people. And in her explaining it to him, he was taken to tears and seen in a new way. And there was the local minister. Oh, I really read carefully this one. It was the local minister who didn't know what he was going to do about the church problems. And Pollyanna told him about the fact that her father was a minister, and that he had that he said he would never have stayed a minister if it wasn't for the rejoicing texts. The texts in the scriptures that are about rejoicing and being glad and being grateful. And so one time, she said, when her dad was feeling sad, he counted them and came up with like 800 in the Bible. And she said that he felt better right away. And he said that if God took the trouble to tell us 800 times to be glad and rejoice, he must want us to do it some, So she went on to share the glad game with all these people. And the story kind of concludes where she gets hit by a car, and she's injured, and it's very serious. And the prognosis is that it's believed that she'll never walk again. And the town knows her by now. She's had this impact, and she's made a huge difference in so many people's lives. And they all come by to visit her, but she's too weak to see everyone. And so the aunt keeps some of them out from going in and seeing. And they say, well, I have to tell her what she's meant to me. And so they tell the story to the aunt as to the impact that she's had in all these numerous ways. And just steadily the heart of the aunt keeps melting and melting. And she's getting what life is about and what she has missed and the adjustment that she needs to make in letting go of her past and taking on the glad game. And so in the end, she begins to make her way back to walking again. And it's a very heartwarming, moving story. And it awakens that part in all of us that says, Dadgum, I think I'm here to play the just be glad game. that part of us that wants to bring light wherever we may find ourselves in some ways. I had a business manager who, some years ago, he's retired now, he took his wife on a vacation in the mountains, and his car broke down, and he was one that wouldn't be very happy with that at all. But he came back, and he was telling all the things he was glad for. And basically, it really was. It went on and on. He had to pay $2,000. They had to spend the night waiting for it to be fixed in Albuquerque. And what he said was how glad he was that the breakdown had happened coming out of the mountains and not while they had been way up there in them. And how glad he was for all the lifts that people gave him to get to a place where he could get help. He was glad and grateful for the fact that the breakdown was within 2.5 miles of the only Saab dealership within 100 miles. He was glad that he had to pay $2,000 to have it fixed, because it would have been $3,000 really, because his engine block had started to melt, and they found a used one that fit. They were able to replace it, saved $1,000 because they were able to get a used one. All those things were true and happened. But the biggest of all was he was so happy and gloated over how happy his wife was that normally these kinds of things would have just destroyed their time together, and how loving and appreciative she was that he had kept his spirits up, and he didn't let it ruin their time together. They had a great couple of days in Albuquerque, and he came back just so proud of himself because he had lived the glad game. I don't know if he'd read the book or what, but it was amazing. So Pollyanna teaches us some very effective aspects to the game of life, really. It's a good game. Just be glad game. And I hope the word Pollyanna has become a word that is more acceptable to you than maybe how you've seen it used in the past. And maybe you know someone who needs to learn the game of just be glad game. And maybe some of us here may recognize that we need to learn the game. We may check our Pollyanna meter, and it's a little low. And so sometimes we think things have to be so spiritually deep in order for them to be meaningful. But sometimes the most simple thoughts and ideas can be the most profound and make the greatest difference. And so it's a beautiful story, and it makes clear how a small child